Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this instalment, Dev Patel and Jeremy Irons star in the inspirational biopic The Man Who Knew Infinity. Srinivasa Ramanujan, played by Dev Patel, may have grown up poor in Madras and not formally trained in pure mathematics, but that didn't impede his astonishing talents with numbers and formulae, constantly inspired to write new equations. When his work is brought to the attention of G.H. Hardy, played by Jeremy Irons, he brings Ramanujan to Trinity College at Cambridge University to prove his work so it can be published. But Ramanujan finds it difficult living in England as he faces skepticism and intolerance to his race and abilities from senior figures at the university. Ramanujan may not be a household name, but he's one of those revered and influential figures in mathematics, especially in his home country of India, and his work was truly groundbreaking. You get a sense of that when I say that it's still being used in calculations about black hole theory, and there was a discovery of previously unseen notebooks that means that his work is still being proven to this day, which shows you just how dense and remarkable his body of work is for such a short life, in fact, which probably gives you an idea of just why they've decided to make a film about him. Now, the issue in making a movie about either physicists or mathematicians is that they're trying to make this successful to a mainstream audience, and generally the theory is considered to be too complex to translate. So what they normally do in these kinds of biopics is they shy away from that particular part and focus on their life. They try and frame it as a triumph against adversity in some way. The theory of everything seems to be a particular structure for this movie and is a worthy source of comparison. Hawking regretted to some extent the movie didn't have a lot of hard science in it. But you can understand why, especially since Hawking's life story, his battle against motor neuron disease, provides the sort of perfect narrative structure for that film to take. But at the same time, while you're watching that movie, you still got a sense of accomplishment, not just because his battle against his diagnosis, but also because you had those scenes between Hawking and his wife which explore the theological ramifications of his theories, that give you a sense of just how groundbreaking and how revolutionary they are, while at the same time not entirely giving you the full spectrum of what Hawking's work actually covers. In The Man Who Knew Infinity, the issue is that I didn't really get a sense of Ramanujan's work or why it was so significant. The film goes out of its way to not tell you anything about Ramanujan's work. All we see is a lot of things being scribbled down on paper or being written on blackboards, and for all we know, it could be just total gibberish. I have a feeling that it's not, because this film has a number of mathematicians involved with it, but those mean nothing to the audience because they don't try to explain them. The movie even seems to have an attitude in that it's just frankly impossible to explain it to an audience. There's a scene where Jeremy Irons does briefly explain something, and I'll get to that in a second, and he says, even you'll be able to understand this one. Faintly condescending about that. I was a little bit frustrated by it because I wanted to know about Ramanujan, who I previously wasn't very familiar with before seeing this film. I consider myself to be a relatively smart person, but I am aware of the fact that I am not really wired for mathematics or physics. I'm just not. But even still, I would have liked the film to sort of throw the ideas that Ramanujan came up with at me and have me not understand them than not have them in the movie at all. The only thing that they do try to explain is partitions. Partitions is numbers by the number of ways that you can add up to them. So a partition with the power of 4, for example, that would be the number 5, because you can add up to the number 5 in 4 different ways. And of course it gets a lot more complicated when you get to powers of 200, for example. And a lot of The Man Who Knew Infinity is about Ramanujan trying to crack a formulae where you can plug in the numbers and you could get you could get the answer to that, for example. And it's just frustrating because so much of Ramanujan's life was based around mathematics. It was his world. And I know that's very difficult for a film to bring to us. He doesn't see the world like everyone else. That was the whole point. And because he wasn't properly trained in mathematics, he taught himself, so his work really went all over the place in that he would reach these extraordinary conclusions, but there would be missteps or things like that, and it would make them very hard to prove. And that tension at having to be forced to try and slow down is what drives a lot of the conflict between him and Hardy at first. Hardy is trying to get him to do that for his own good, for his own benefit. And we only really get a sense of how Ramanujan's mind works in sort of metaphor. There's a very early scene, for example, where he's picking up a handful of sand and he suggests to imagine being able to calculate the possibilities of every particle, for example. That gives you a vague idea of just how he sees the world as this series of things that are dictated by an order that may not be apparent to the eye, but can be equated through mathematics. But aside from that, we don't really get a sense of how Ramanujan properly thinks. And the film compensates for this to some extent by being very factually accurate to his life, very much charting all the events. The problem is when you plug in something like that, especially into the inspirational biopic format, it does become rather generic, which is unusual because Ramanujan's life has a lot in it that is very remarkable about it. The fact that he managed to transcend his origins and come to Cambridge and become an especially respected person there. That is a remarkable story in real life, but on film it comes across as a standard biopic. There is no cliche here that is left unturned, with maybe the exception of the slow clap scene, which is replaced by a slow knocking on tables cheering him on instead. But that's not to say the film is badly made. It's actually very well made. For a film that was obviously shot on a low budget, it feels remarkably authentic, and I think a lot of that comes down to the fact they did actually shoot at Trinity College, so you do get a sense of verisimilitude there. You do get a real sense of atmosphere. In some ways, the movie does try to compensate for some of the void at its centre with regards to Ramanujan by drifting away from him at certain points in the narrative, and some of this does feel like filler to some extent. The scenes in India, for example, with his wife, who is dealing with the fact that his possessive mother is trying to separate them. That doesn't really need to be in this story. It does feel like a distraction, like they had to have some scenes set in India because the investors might want them, for example. The outbreak of World War I occurs during this story, and obviously a lot of the people at Cambridge, including some of the professors, are being sent to fight in the war. But again, it's only really a side detail. It doesn't really play a crucial part in the narrative. But what these things do is they very much give you a sense of the period. It very much gives you a sense of what Cambridge was like in that time. It perhaps succeeds more at conveying that than it actually does at portraying Ramanujan. But the film's real strength is its cast, especially Dev Patel and Jeremy Irons. Patel is especially good here. He to some extent makes up for some of the problems with characterization in the script. He really gets across the idea that he is a man in a world that's turbulent and unsettling and very far from home, that he misses everything about it, and he feels like an outsider constantly in a world that is very sceptical and at times outright hostile towards him. He gives a terrific performance here, but even more so, Jeremy Irons as G.H. Hardy is brilliant. He owns every single scene he's in. Every time that he appears on screen, he manages to really rise the movie up almost by sheer force, even when he's doing a triumphant speech, of which he does several times, but he especially digs his teeth into one of the film's major themes, which is that of religion. Hardy was a staunch atheist, whereas compared to Ramanujan, he was very much into his faith. He was very much into believing that his theories came from God, that he was in some way blessed, and to some extent the movie does seem to side with that argument, in that it does tend to push Ramanujan's abilities towards almost godlike in some senses, which might be why, again, they don't try and focus on his work so much as more giving an impression of it to the audience. And you have these sort of battles between Irons and Patel, but they're intellectual battles, and you can tell that they both have this very shared mutual respect for one another. And you can tell throughout the entire movie that Irons' Hardy just really wants Ramanujan to succeed. He really wants his work to be recognised. He sees something truly extraordinary. He just has to nurture it properly. And that relationship manages to enrich them both. I have seen this in some reviews referred to as a mathematical bromance, which I think harkens back to an early line where Hardy refers to the relationship between them as being the closest thing to a romantic relationship that he's ever known, which did interest me because it implies a subtext to their friendship that the rest of the film doesn't really explore. But there's also greatness in the supporting cast, like Toby Jones as Hardy's associate Littlewood, Jeremy Northam as Bertrand Russell. You even have Stephen Fry in a very tiny role. He appears in 3 brief scenes in the first 10-15 minutes of the movie and doesn't really appear after that. But all of them add to this very cosy, very comfortable, very watchable, middle-brow approach this film is taking. And they enrich the sense of Cambridge heritage that the movie is trying to depict. And even when the movie is depicting scenes of quite abject racism and intolerance, especially in a hate crime committed by soldiers who see him as an enemy, there's a real warmth and compassion to the film that links up with the friendship between Ramanujan and Hardy that does leave you feeling satisfied on an emotional level. And that's the issue with The Man Who Knew Infinity, in that it takes this very hard to understand but very interesting figure and enlightens us about him but doesn't educate us on him. It's understandable that The Man Who Knew Infinity has trouble trying to make Ramanujan's work accessible to a mainstream audience given the complexity of his equations that are still being proven to this day, but the film doesn't even try, giving the audience very little understanding of his work or why exactly it remains so important. Instead, it journeys through the standard motions of a biopic with little unique or insightful about its subject to distinguish it, despite dealing with the themes of racism and religion, where even the occurrence of the First World War seems like an incidental detail. However, it is elevated by the performances of Dev Patel and especially Jeremy Irons, who breathe life into the friendship at the centre of this story, and the film is never less than cosy and watchable because it's well made, but it's nowhere near as remarkable as the man that it's based on. Coming up soon, we discover the true horror of receiving a friend request while Idris Elba is a CIA agent hunting down terrorists in Paris in Bastille Day. But until then, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.